Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that this webinar is taking place on Kaurna land and acknowledge elders past and present, and acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are on the webinar today. So welcome to everyone. As normal, we're going to have two speakers. We'll have some questions after the first one and then some questions after the second one. If you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A box and I'll see them and relay them to Michael or Scott. So we're going to start with Associate Professor Michael Penniment, who I'm sure you all know, but is an outstanding leader in radiation oncology, both in South Australia, Northern Territory, but also right across Australia and globally. And South Australia is very lucky to have Michael here. And Michael's going to tell us about building the staff for the Bragg Centre, what trainings is required to be involved in particle therapy.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks everybody for allowing us to talk today. I think that now that the ground's being broken and that first slide shows the team of our friends and experts from political and building, and Steve breaking the ground on the Bragg Centre last year, I think the excitement's really building. And as Steve said, I acknowledge that we're on Kaurna land where I'm giving this presentation. Obviously with Zoom, we're all over the place, but I think one of the things with the Bragg Centre, moving to the next slide, that really highlights to me our heritage is indeed the name, the Bragg Centre. And I think many of you will know now that the Bragg father and son team that are synonymous with the very essence of why proton therapy works in cancer treatment were born in South Australia and did most of their research at Adelaide Uni. Whenever I've presented around the world in the good old days, whenever I've said that the Braggs came from South Australia, it really created an enormous historical buzz that we really were the focus for where this came from. They won the Nobel Prize in 1915 for X-ray crystallography. And this slide shows so much, I think. In essence, this slide shows that when a normal radiation oncology treatment with X-rays hits a patient's surface, a lot of the energy is given off as soon as the X-ray beam hits the patient's surface, and then it gradually gets attenuated through the patient's body. Whereas proton beams with heavy charged particles tend to give some of their energy off, but then they give a lot of energy deep in the tissues when they're getting towards the end of their range. And now that's really critical. I think that you'll be able to see, I've put a little schematic of a critical organ. Let's assume that there's a cancer that's sitting next to the spinal cord. The beauty of proton therapy is that you can deliver radiation treatment right up to millimeter accuracy of the base of the tumour and spare something deep like the spinal cord. And for that, we have the Braggs and their original work to thank. And this is a slide that is fairly contemporary. It was a few months ago with myself, Peter Garaski, Ian Lee and Scott, who you'll hear from in a minute, at the building site. We did get a little bit of comment about, is it a boys' club? It's very much not. It's, in fact, we are such a growing team of absolute diversity that really it wasn't until that comment was posted I realised, yeah, okay, it looks like a boy band. But the team is growing. It's growing quite quickly. And I really wanted to use this presentation, not so much to go into the basics of what proton therapy is, but more how people that are out there that, unfortunately I can't see, I can't walk up to you after the presentation and have a chat, how you can engage with us and get excited that this is happening. It's happening in Australia. We're creating one of the world's great cancer centres. Already we have a team that includes a number of radiation oncologists, a small group of radiation therapists, an increasing group of medical physicists, PhD students, University of SA, and certainly University of Adelaide is very intimate in the radiation oncology medical physics training, and we'll talk a bit more about that. And a number of our staff, most of whom started their journey in radiation oncology through the Royal Adelaide Hospital, a number of us have been to courses as diverse as the UPenn course in Philadelphia. Scott, who, as I say, you'll hear from, worked for some time in Boston, as did Ian Lee. And the next phase now is that team is, I'm very proud to say, is recognised as an internationally worthy team to lead this project. And so we've already begun local training of people that are doing undergraduate degrees, are involved in cancer treatment of all descriptions. As we get closer to the start of the unit, and I'll talk a bit more about that, we'll be looking at obviously key hires and also interstate colleagues that are working with us. And in terms of just very broadly, local training, it involves, obviously people get into radiation oncology through either a medical degree and radiation oncology specialist training, or a medical radiations degree, or medical physics, or of course, nursing, biomedical engineering, administration, many other ways. And so we're looking in particular with the University of Adelaide at how we bring specific particle therapy knowledge into the training for medical physicists, and also how we expand the core knowledge of radiation oncology to medical students. We also work with the University of Adelaide and indeed Flinders University in terms of radiation therapists and other people working in the area. University of Adelaide, we would hope we will start some micro degree courses. We have PhD opportunities. And I think what we should say is that proton therapy is not so different to radiation oncology that it requires a complete change of path. It's basically doing the degree that you're doing with perhaps a module, with some extra training, whether it be postgraduate or undergraduate. And I'm on the board of one of the world major particle therapy associations, and in particular in Asia, Oceania, there's an increasing number of proton therapy centres that are being built, and there's a very big staffing requirement. And they're looking to us with our expertise in delivering Western medicine and training to be very important in the precinct. So lots of opportunities. And sorry, I'm going back, but going forward, the other thing is interstate. We're recognising that radiation oncology is a very big practice across the country, and key people from each state will be involved in what is very much a national facility in South Australia. So it looks like my video is going to work, and you'll know SAHMRI very well. What was next to it was a small block of land that had the transit station for the railway, and then the University of Adelaide building that you can see. Arising out of the shell of the transit station is now the 13-storey Bragg Centre. The last 3 floors will be the Proton Therapy Centre, and then there'll be a number of other really exciting developments that will be involved in the upper stories, which will create essentially a comprehensive cancer centre, very much the equal to anything in the world. And, you know, obviously there's a lot of exciting things happening in South Australia, and I think we fit very nicely in the centre of that. The new Royal Adelaide, which is really, we'll have to stop calling it new now because it's been around for a while. The SAHMRI, of course, we're very proud of. So we're doing a lot of things, but just briefly some of the things that we're doing. Comparative planning is something I could give a very long talk on. In essence, one of the things we've decided to do about 4 or 5 years ago was when somebody has radiation oncology, they have a CAT scan, we work out where the tumour is, we work out where the structures that we want to avoid are, and we do very complex CT-based planning to work out what happens when those photons of energy hit the patient. We decided that we would try and do the same thing with proton therapy, which built us up a very significant bank of knowledge and understanding of how protons worked. And Scott will talk a little more about that too. But in essence, that then led to the federal government not only giving us the okay to be the centre for the national facility, but also the MTOP process, the Medical Treatment Overseas Program, which obviously COVID has put a little bit of a spin on at the moment. But in essence, if you need proton therapy, then previously you'd need to travel overseas. We're talking with our very close colleagues in places like Singapore, and I'm sure that we will start to open up opportunities. But in essence, the more important thing that it's done is it's trained a local workforce, and it's given us also a unit that exists right now that if you want to be involved in looking at how you can plan patients for proton therapy treatment, whether you're involved in medical physics or radiation therapy or clinical use, but also diverse things such as the Australian Institute of Machine Learning and looking at automated solutions using data-driven solutions for treatment planning. Really, there's a lot of deep things that we can do, and we already have a surprisingly significant international reputation. We've also obviously continued to do a journal club, and we welcome people being involved. That's a good way to sort of just to meet with the group and have a understanding of what's hot in the area. We're applying for a number of grants, and so knowing what is hot in the literature and knowing what is the clinical deficits in this region are very important. The PPCR is Proton Therapy, the Particle Therapy Pediatric Cancer Registry, which is really, I should put that in orange and make it flash, because that's our Mass General Harvard colleagues have a very significant research database across all the major centers in USA, and we were the first center outside the USA that was asked to join, and it includes UPenn, MD Anderson, some major research institutions, and we're now collaborating in terms of that database, which is really quite significant. And as I say, grant proposals that really everything from industrial design to medical physics to clinical, and please put up your hand if you're interested. That's the floor plan. In essence, 3 rooms, 2 rooms with very large gantries that revolve around the patient to deliver very accurate cancer treatment, and a 3rd room that has a split of the beam, and one beam will be used for ocular tumours and some other types of things, and the other for research, so that there's access to a very high energy particle therapy beam, which Scott will talk about a little more. We're picking out the furniture for the unit. Those that have been to the Broad in Los Angeles will know that's actually not me photoshopped, and indeed that's not the furniture. It's not even, well, we'll get smaller stuff for the actual centre and it'll fit beautifully. So the build's commenced. Everything you want to know might be in this slide. Comprehensive Cancer Centre. We're hoping to actually really highlight not only Bragg and not only protons and not only radiation oncology, but all the expertise in cancer treatment that's in Adelaide. We really are world leaders in a lot of areas, bringing it together for a Bragg Comprehensive Cancer Centre, which could well be in the new building as early as 2023, where the installation of the synchrotron will start. And there may also be, we're very hopeful that there'll be a testing facility and assembly line for the actual synchrotron machinery that could also be built in a separate spot sort of by late next year. And clearly, if we're bringing a lot of patients in from the region, Australia, New Zealand and beyond, new accommodation facilities that we're also talking about. This final slide is just to do the final link. There's a lot of you, I think, hopefully that are young up-and-coming researchers. This was actually Prost Day from the Adelaide Uni in 1905. One of those people in the fancy dress is one of the Braggs. Yes, they went on to change the whole face of radiation oncology, win a Nobel Prize, but they were students having fun at Adelaide Uni as well back in the old days. So there's a link between what we're all doing now and the future, and be excited because I think you'll sense that we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Great talk. If there are people out there who, may be working in animal models or other cancer models or interested in radiation therapy, how's the best way to get into contact with the team that's growing and talk to them about research ideas and thoughts and opportunities to write grants to NHMRC and other places?
Well, I think that really we're very contactable through the Royal Adelaide and through SAHMRI, and I think certainly most of us, I'm certainly michael.penniment.sa.gov.au. I should have put on the slides, but I think there's a number of us that can go through that. Likewise, the Royal Adelaide Hospital, if you go to radiation oncology, it will link through to proton therapy. or indeed there's a website specifically for the Bragg Centre. So I think all of those things will link us, but very keen to talk, and as will Scott, I'm sure.
And if people aren't involved in animal or human clinical research, but interested in data, perhaps registry data and other stuff, is there opportunities for them as well, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that we are working on now is that we know we're in an unusual situation with the delivery of healthcare, which is always very state-based. This is a national facility, federal government funded, and we will be having a very high level of high percentage of people going through the centre will be involved in clinical trials. And certainly everybody we expect that will be going through the centre nationally and internationally will be involved in data directories. And so we want to A, build them, and also B, questions that people can get answers to from that data. The PPCR, the one that we're doing with Harvard and Boston and whatever, that's already a very rich source of proton therapy data. And so good questions, we can put good questions up as to that.
Okay, we're a little bit over time, but there is a question on the Q&A, and it relates to are there particular tumours that this treatment is better for, or cancers in general?
Definitely outstanding for paediatric. I think in essence, the two things that it does is it allows you to spare normal tissues, which sometimes means you can drive the dose to a cancer a little higher. So some cancers like chordomas respond better to higher doses, which we usually can't deliver because of toxicity. And other cancers, as I say, in particular pediatric, where some structures that we wouldn't be too worried about in adults, like growing bone or salivary glands, are critical for long-term good health of a child. And so we expect probably 70 or 80% of children needing radiotherapy will be treated in our centre. With adults, it's more skull-based tumours, spinal, close to spine, close to critical structures. Yeah.
All right, I did say it was the last question, but actually they keep on coming now. Greg Brown is asking about, are there supportive imaging facilities being incorporated to handle cancer clinical work? And Paul Flynn, presumably from the Hospital Foundation, thanks Paul for being online. What are the areas of grant funding requirements you have, Michael?
Well, you can link those two very well, and indeed you could segue into Scott's presentation, I suspect, because imaging is something that I really think we can lead the world in terms of when a patient's on the bed, we can do cone beam CTs and things, but we can do more than that. And the accuracy of this is really accurate treatment. So we want very high level accuracy to know exactly that we're hitting the right spot. Some of that is fairly, we will buy it with the machine and we know what we're getting, but there's other things that in particular, Scott is a world leader in terms of imaging. We're putting up some grants as we speak that to develop what I would sort of say it will be a centre of imaging excellence in terms of developing a variety of imaging solutions, which will basically, you know, there's a lot of gaps. This is an area that we're not coming into that's fully developed. We are part of the whole expansile growth, and imaging is probably the biggest part of that.
All right, thanks, Michael. And no doubt your team would love to talk to Paul more. So that's a great link.
Absolutely.
Being on board, Paul. We will go a little bit over time. The next question said, very impressed with the plan. The plan and protocol is recognised in other international centres such as Essen. So I know, Michael, that you know the group in Essen, Germany, and have been talking to them. So I'll move along because we want to get to Scott. And the next question was about, are we expecting a big cohort of children from elsewhere to South Australia for treatment? And is that being factored in the plans for the new WCH? And absolutely, we are expecting children from all over Australia, and the oncology team, Michael, you might talk to that, but the oncology team at the WCH are involved in the planning.
Yeah, absolutely. 250 children in Australia at the moment get radiotherapy a year. We've estimated from our colleagues overseas, it's going to be 160 to 180, something like that. That's a massive expansion on what we have. Again, big opportunity. We're already looking to bring, there's a couple of paediatric oncologists that are overseas looking to come back to Australia, or indeed to come to Adelaide. A lot of planning there. We've got a couple of years. It's under control, but it's also an area that we would love to have more discussion about.
Okay, we're going to stop those questions. Way too many questions for Michael. We have to, and I know he would talk all day, so we do have to move away from Michael and go to Scott. Scott is a medical physicist, as Michael alluded to. He has spent time in Boston at MGH, with the first centre in the world to have proton therapy. And Scott is also the first employee of the Australian Bragg Centre for Proton Therapy and Research. So great to have you on board, Scott, and I'll let you tell us all about it.
Thanks, Steve. So the first thing I was going to talk about was just to clarify the similarities and differences between the proton accelerators that we have as part of the Adelaide Biomed City. So you would have heard about the cyclotron that lives in the basement of the current SAHMRI building. So it's a rather compact unit. The purpose of this system is to accelerate protons, slam them into a target and generate specific radioactive isotopes that can then be used for diagnostics and or therapeutics. So yeah, it's really a manufacturing device. What we will be installing in the Australian Bragg Centre is a synchrotron accelerator. So it's this big ring structure, and it's about 4 meters in diameter, and it can accelerate protons to much higher energies. So the SAHMRI cyclotron is capable of accelerating protons to roughly 18 MeV. That's just shy of 20% of the speed of light. And to give you an idea of how fast that is, so the energy that we give to those protons is the equivalent of getting to a speed where they could go around the Earth 1.5 times every second. So it is very quick. But the accelerator we will be installing is a different kind of beast. It can accelerate protons to 330 MeV. And that's 67% the speed of light, and those protons could go around the Earth 5 times every second. So it is a large amount of energy that we are imparting to these subatomic particles, and it does draw on a lot of energy to get that result. The other interesting thing from a physics perspective is that the synchrotron accelerates particles to a speed where they really enter the realms of relativity. So the protons start to get more massive because they can't get any faster than the speed of light. And I think an interesting point is that this is actually Australia's highest energy proton accelerator. So not only is it a very unique medical device, it's also a unique piece of scientific infrastructure that will be housed here in Adelaide. So the accelerator all lives behind the wall. The patient never sees that side of things. This is the nice clinical side that the patient will see. And basically proton therapy is a form of advanced radiotherapy. So what happens is the patient is lying on the treatment couch here. It's on a fully robotic positioning system, and this robotic system moves the center of the tumor to a very specific point within the room. The protons, they're all accelerated behind the wall, and then they come out this nozzle structure here. So they come out of the wall through the nozzle and into the patient, as Michael was describing in that Bragg peak fashion. And this nozzle, you can see it will rotate around this specific point in space so that we can target the tumor from a number of different directions. As Michael said, in general, proton therapy can reduce the side effects of treatment compared to conventional X-ray therapy, and it does that by reducing the radiation dose to healthy tissues while maintaining the same dose to the cancer as you would with X-ray therapy. And also, as Michael said, it's particularly advantageous for children because it does spare those tissues that are still growing, and because children can be treated with a high degree of efficacy, so they will go on to live for a long time after treatment. So we really want to make sure that their quality of life, their quality of life is as good as possible, and their toxicity is as low as possible. So the purpose of this talk was to talk about some of the technical research opportunities that we will have at the Bragg Centre. Research definitely plays a big part in proton therapy. It's an emerging type of treatment, but it's also very technologically advanced, so we need to continue to develop it. Our broad research streams are divided into technical, preclinical, and clinical. In the technical aspects, we are talking about medical physics, so that's physics applied to proton therapy. But also away from the medical side, we can conduct experiments in nuclear physics, testing interaction cross-sections, materials testing, so testing how things respond to high radiation environments. And also the proton accelerator can produce an environment that is somewhat like what satellites and astronauts experience in space, where we have high energy protons basically going all over the place. So it's a useful simulation of that environment. In preclinical research, we're talking about things like in vitro radiobiology, in vivo radiobiology, so trying to understand the really core mechanisms of how protons interact with different cellular and tissue structures. And in clinical research, we're of course talking about clinical trials, so testing how proton therapy can be delivered in different ways to increase the clinical benefit. So being a physicist, I focus more on the technical aspects, and the next two projects that I'll talk about very briefly are specifically in the medical physics realm. So one of the projects we're looking into is how we can reduce the cost of proton therapy so it can be made more widely available. There will be more proton therapy sites in Australia, so we want to make sure that they're delivered as cost effectively as possible. So the gantry structures that I was talking about, they are very large structures. They take up 3 floors of space. And we need that space to be able to bend the proton beam to that point in the room about which it is focused. So on the left here, you can see the man that gives a bit of a scale representation, and this is all behind the scenes of the proton therapy bunker. So the gantries themselves are very expensive, but then also the concrete that you need to shield this radiation space, because you're shielding such a large volume, the concrete shielding itself is also very expensive. So an alternative approach that is being investigated is whether we can replace the gantry type system with an upright treatment system, where instead of rotating the proton beam stays fixed, but now we rotate the patient around very slowly to obtain the different treatment angles. So we're working with a vendor of one of these systems to see if we can install such a system in the research beamline at the Australian Bragg Centre. And the end objective of all this is that we can test, we can arrive at a significant cost reduction for proton therapy, reduction in the space that's required, and that will allow us to increase the availability for cancer patients. The other project that I was going to talk about today is to do with proton imaging. Michael was referring to this. So what happens is when we plan a proton therapy treatment, we take an X-ray CT scan of the patient, we outline the target that we're attempting to treat, but there are inherent uncertainties about how the proton beam interacts with the patient and also where the patient is positioned within the room. They are small uncertainties, but they are nonetheless present. So to treat those uncertainties, we have to use margins on the actual tumour volume to make sure that at each treatment, we're capturing the entire cancer within the treatment volume. So an alternative approach to to handling one of the uncertainties that is associated with converting X-ray CT scans to the values that are actually required to predict what how the proton beam is going to interact with the patient. What we can do is we can, instead of taking an X-ray CT scan, we can take a Proton CT scan. And this picture here shows a conceptual design of what a Proton CT scan looks like. So now we have a higher energy proton beam that, instead of depositing dose at the cancer site, it goes all the way through the patient. And by recording, by measuring what happens to those protons before and after the patient, we're able to generate a CT scan that will essentially look something like this, but the actual pixel values give us the information that we need to generate the treatment plan to a higher precision. So the outcome of all of this is that we are able to reduce the uncertainty of the treatment volume. If we are able to reduce those uncertainty margins, we can reduce the volume of healthy tissue that gets irradiated as part of the treatment. And then following on from that, if we can reduce the volume of healthy tissue being irradiated, we can potentially reduce the side effects of treatment. So here we want to make sure that we are reducing toxicity as much as possible by using more precise forms of imaging. That was a very quick roundup of what we're planning in some of the small projects at the Bragg Centre in the future.
Thanks very much, Scott. And obviously it does indicate the breadth of things we can look at. I did notice in your diagram that the technical research took up 2/3 of the diagram, and clinical research a much smaller part. Is that the way you see it, or is that just a bias from a medical physicist?
That's a bias that came in through the Microsoft Office formatting. That's nothing to do with the actual concept.
I'm waiting for some other questions to come into the Q&A. They came in a bit of a rush last time, but I'll keep the conversation going. In terms of the chair, having people sit and have proton therapy, is there anywhere in the world that actually happens at the moment?
There's a centre in Chicago at Northwestern where they have a upright patient treatment system. They're slightly different in that they have an inclined proton beam, so the chair itself is slightly reclined. So a fully upright system is still quite new. There is a research installation in Europe at the moment, but we would certainly be on the leading edge if we were to undertake that installation. And
do in photons, that is, standard radiation therapy, can you have photon therapy sitting in a chair?
Yeah, and this particular company that we're working with, they offer the same type of system for photon therapy. And the advantage there is that they provide a full self-shielding, so you could really make a mobile radiotherapy clinic with X-rays and upright patient treatment. So it really is exciting in terms of making radiotherapy more available to rural communities in that aspect.
Thanks, Scott. And again, still waiting for anyone who would have any other questions to put in the Q&A before we wind up. But I understand that the chair concept, which would be one of the first in the world, you're looking for funding from the Australian Cancer Research Foundation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. We're currently preparing a grant application. So we look forward to putting forward something that's really exciting for them to consider.
All right. If there are no other questions, I'd like to, and I do apologise for rushing through some of Michael's questions. They always come at the end. So here's a question. Does the increased accuracy of proton therapy have any impact on the resultant immune anti-tumour response? More immunostimulatory or not? There's a good question for you, Scott, or Michael.
Yeah, that's a great question. Michael may be a better person to answer this, but I'll give it an initial shot. There are definitely groups looking at whether combined radiotherapy, immunotherapy is more effective with proton therapy, because proton therapy doesn't have that low dose bath of radiation that goes to pretty much the whole patient within the plane of the tumour. The theory is that there is less suppression of the immune system with proton therapy, so it may be a better combination.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah,
Michael, do you want to comment on that?
Look, just to add in that I think that's something that we're going to collaborate with some other groups that will be in the centre as well, because obviously with very precise treatment you can essentially get rid of all the small focuses of mass disease in somebody that's got small metastatic lung cancer, whilst the immune response mops up the rest. So we don't really we can either have a minimal immune effect, or there's also the potential, if you send a high dose into a cancer, that it has a sort of an abscope or outside the tumour effect. These are all things that are absolute cutting edge, and I think the Bragg Centre, the whole building, will be able to lead on a lot of that.
Thanks, Michael. And we have a question from Peter Gorowski, and he would like to know, will the Bragg Centre synchrotron be able to deliver flash irradiation?
Yep, good question. So the synchrotron hasn't been tested for that specific application, but there is a synchrotron system that's installed in Japan that have recently published on their experience in delivering flash. So it is technically possible with that accelerator technology, but it does require specific configurations.
Thanks, Scott. I think that question had a bit of insider information, but a very good question nevertheless. So I think we'll wrap it up there. We're a little bit over time, but I think what we've seen today is the opportunities that exist with the development of the Australian Bragg Centre for Proton Therapy and Research. Particularly, we have talked a little bit about the benefits for patients, but quite a lot, and rightly so, for this webinar on the research opportunities. And so I encourage everyone to think about those. And if people need any more information about research opportunities, funding opportunities, and so on, please contact Michael and Scott. Finally, I'd like to thank Michael and Scott for some great talks, and thank Tamara for organising it. Thank you very much.